Something is changing, quietly. No press conference, no hashtag, no march down Main Street. Just men disappearing from the places you'd expect to find them. Fewer men on dating apps who actually respond. Fewer men chasing marriage like it's the finish line of adulthood. Fewer men saying yes to the version of life they were handed at 18 and told to just follow. Ask a woman in her 30s what dating feels like right now. You'll hear some version of the same complaint. The good ones aren't trying anymore. Funny thing is, she's not wrong. They're not gone. They didn't vanish into thin air. They just stopped raising their hands. And here's the part that should make you pause. This isn't a handful of bitter guys in a basement somewhere. It's a pattern, growing, spreading in more places than you'd expect. And almost nobody is talking about why. So here's the real question. Why are more men quietly walking away from the life they were promised? And why does it keep getting bigger? Let's start with the blueprint, because before you can understand why men are leaving it, you have to understand what it actually was. Go to school, get good grades, get a degree, ideally one that means something. Get a job, climb, get a better job, buy a car you can barely afford to prove you're doing fine, find a woman, impress her, commit to her, get a ring, get a house, get a mortgage that owns you for the next 30 years, have kids, provide. Repeat until retirement, if retirement even still exists by then. Nobody sat little boys down and explained this like a business plan. It arrived quietly, through movies, through fathers, through offhand comments at Thanksgiving dinner. When are you going to settle down? You'll understand once you have a family. A man isn't really a man until he's providing for someone. The promise baked into all of it was simple. Follow the steps and the reward is happiness, fulfillment, respect, a life that means something. Nobody promised it would be easy, but everybody promised it would be worth it. That was the deal. Here's where it gets uncomfortable, because for a lot of men, the deal never delivered what it advertised. He does the job. 50 hours a week, sometimes more, because that's what providing looks like now. He proposes, he plans a wedding neither of them can really afford because the wedding industry doesn't care about your budget. It cares about the one perfect day. He signs the mortgage. He becomes functionally a walking financial obligation with a pulse. And somewhere in there, a thought creeps in that he never says out loud. Is this it? Divorce doesn't help the math. He's seen the story before. A friend, a coworker, an uncle. Married for a decade, then one day it's over and he's not living in his own house anymore. He's paying for two. Dating doesn't help either. He matches, he messages. He gets ghosted by someone who was really excited to meet up 4 days ago. He shows up prepared to be a provider, a protector, a partner, and finds himself competing for attention with 100 other profiles, most of whom will never even open his message. It's exhausting in a way that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't lived it. Not dramatic, not a single traumatic event, just death by 1,000 small disappointments, bills, ghosting, unequal effort, a relationship that takes more than it gives, a promotion that goes to someone else, a blueprint that keeps demanding more input for less and less output. At some point, a question starts forming that he can't quite shake. What if the problem isn't that I'm doing it wrong? What if the problem is the deal itself? Think about how lopsided that deal actually looks once you write it down. He's expected to earn, to protect, to plan for a future that isn't guaranteed to exist the way it was described. Meanwhile, the rules around commitment, around what counts as enough effort, keep shifting under his feet. One relationship ends and he loses the apartment, half the savings, sometimes the dog. Another one just quietly drains him for years, effort going one direction, appreciation rarely coming back the other way. And the strange part is how normal all of this is treated. Nobody around him is shocked. Everybody just shrugs and says, well, that's relationships. Except it didn't used to feel this one-sided, or maybe it did. And nobody had the space to say so out loud. But here's what makes this different. That question doesn't arrive with fireworks. It shows up on an ordinary Tuesday. Maybe he's sitting in traffic after another 12-hour shift, doing mental math, rent, car payment, a relationship that feels more like a part-time job with no benefits. And instead of asking, how do I fix this, he asks something different. What happens if I just stop? Not stop working, not stop living, stop performing the specific script he was handed. Stop chasing milestones that were supposed to feel like victories but mostly feel like debt. This is the quiet part. There's no announcement, no declaration to friends and family that he's done with dating or opting out of marriage. He just starts making different choices. He cancels the third date that felt like an unpaid interview. He puts the money he was saving for a ring into a down payment on a place that's just his. He starts spending Saturday mornings at the gym instead of scrolling apps that make him feel worse every time he opens them. Nobody notices at first. Withdrawal, when it's quiet, looks a lot like just living your life. But multiply that decision by a few million men making it independently without ever comparing notes. And suddenly you've got something that looks less like a personal choice and more like a pattern. At some point, that pattern got a name. MGTOW, men going their own way. And before you picture whatever the internet has told you to picture, let's actually define it, because the caricature and the reality are not the same thing. At its core, the idea is almost boringly simple. A man deciding to prioritize his own goals, his own peace, his own time and money. Instead of organizing his entire life around a relationship or a family structure that traditional culture told him was mandatory. That's it. That's the seed. What grows from that seed looks different depending on who you ask. For one man, it means simply staying single, focusing on his career, his health, his friendships, and being genuinely fine with that. Not performing contentment, actually living it. For another, it means dating casually, without chasing marriage as the endgame. Because marriage as an institution no longer feels like it's built in his favor. For another, it's more extreme. Full disengagement from women entirely, sometimes wrapped in real anger, sometimes wrapped in real hurt. Here's the part worth sitting with. There is no single MGTOW lifestyle. No handbook everyone follows, no membership card. There are men living some version of it who have never heard the term and never will. And there are men who wear the label loudly online who represent the loudest, angriest slice, not the average one. Judging the whole idea by its most extreme voices is a bit like judging every gym goer by the guy screaming at the squat rack. Technically part of the same category, not remotely representative of the average. So why is this spreading now when the underlying feeling has probably existed for generations? Simple. The internet gave it a mirror. For most of history, a frustrated, disengaged man just felt alone. He assumed something was wrong with him specifically. He had no way to compare notes with anyone else, quietly having the exact same thoughts 3 states away. Now he opens a forum, a comment section under a video exactly like this one, and finds 1,000 men describing his exact internal monologue back to him, almost word for word. That's not a movement recruiting people. That's recognition. And recognition spreads fast. And this is where the numbers become misleading. Algorithms accelerate it further, whether anyone involved intends that or not. One video about burnout in modern dating gets watched by a tired 30-year-old at 1 a.m. Suddenly, his feed is full of 10 more videos saying the exact same thing in 10 different voices. He doesn't feel targeted. He feels understood, maybe for the first time in a long while. That's a very different engine than a traditional movement with meetings and leaders and membership dues. There's no headquarters, no founder to interview, no single spokesperson who represents the position, because there isn't one position. There are millions of individual men arriving at overlapping conclusions, mostly on their own, mostly in silence. Then discovering afterward that plenty of other people got there too. Here's the harder part to measure, and the part that makes this genuinely tricky to study. Most men living this out never say the word MGTOW out loud, ever. He's not posting manifestos, he's not in any forum. He just quietly decided marriage isn't for him right now. Dating isn't worth the energy right now. He'd rather build a life around his own priorities. Ask him if he's part of a movement, and he'll probably laugh at you. But functionally, he's living the exact behavior the label was built to describe, which means the visible numbers, the forum members, the subscriber counts, the article headlines, are almost certainly undercounting what's actually happening. The movement isn't loud, it's underneath the surface, growing in silence. One quiet decision at a time. Now let's talk about the part nobody wants to admit feels good, because it does. Imagine a Tuesday night with absolutely nothing on it, no plans to negotiate, no compromise required, well, what does she want to do? Just him, dinner he actually wanted to eat, and total silence if that's what he's in the mood for. That's not loneliness. Loneliness has a specific texture, a specific ache to it. This is something closer to relief. Money behaves differently too. No wedding to finance, no engagement ring that costs 3 months of salary for a tradition nobody can even explain the logic of anymore. No shared expenses funding someone else's spending habits while he tightens his own budget. His paycheck goes toward things he chose, a better apartment, a trip he's wanted to take for years, an investment account that's actually growing instead of getting drained by two people's combined bad decisions. Time changes shape completely. Weekends aren't negotiated anymore, they're built. Hobbies that got quietly shelved during his last relationship, the guitar, the hiking, the side project, come back to life. Friendships get real attention again, instead of the leftover scraps of energy that used to survive after a relationship took the biggest cut. And underneath all of it sits something quieter, harder to name, but very real. Peace, not revenge, not anger, relief, not the performative, I'm so happy being single. Peace people fake for an audience. Actual peace, the kind that comes from not constantly managing someone else's expectations, someone else's moods, someone else's version of what your relationship is supposed to look like. For a lot of these men, that peace is the entire point. Not anger, not revenge, not some grand statement against women as a group, just quiet. Finally. But there's another side to this. Here's where it gets complicated, and honestly, where it should get complicated. Because if you've ever actually gone looking for MGTOW content online, you already know it's not all quiet peace and Tuesday night dinners. Some corners of it are genuinely ugly. Men who took one bad relationship, one brutal divorce, one painful betrayal, and instead of processing it, built an entire identity around resenting an entire gender because of it. Forums where she's probably lying becomes the default assumption before any facts are even on the table. Content that stops being about personal freedom and starts being about punishment. Convincing other men that every woman is a financial threat waiting to happen. Every relationship a trap in disguise. That's not autonomy. That's bitterness wearing autonomy's clothes. And it matters to say this clearly, out loud, without hedging it into meaninglessness. There's a real difference between a man who chose peace and a man who chose a grudge. One built a life, the other built a grievance and moved into it permanently. You can usually tell the difference in how each one talks. The man who found peace doesn't need to convince anyone else to join him. He's not recruiting, he's just living his life. Ask him about it, and he'll shrug and tell you it works for him. Take it or leave it. The man who found a grudge needs company. He needs agreement. He posts constantly, argues constantly, treats every disagreement like a personal attack. Because on some level, silence would force him to sit with the original wound he never actually dealt with. That's not a small distinction. It's the entire difference between a coping mechanism that healed something and one that just gave the wound a new place to live. Echo. Chambers make this worse because that's what echo chambers are engineered to do. Say something angry enough in the right forum and it gets rewarded with upvotes, agreement, validation. Regardless of whether it's actually true or fair, isolation feeds the same cycle. A man who's cut himself off from women entirely, who spends most of his time in spaces where the loudest voices are the angriest ones, starts mistaking that anger for wisdom, for waking up, for seeing some truth everyone else is too brainwashed to notice. It isn't wisdom. It's a feedback loop with better production values. The honest version of this conversation has to hold two things at once. Choosing to step back from relationships and the traditional script can be a genuinely healthy, deliberate decision. And some corners of the community built around that same idea have curdled into something closer to hatred than freedom. Both are true. Pretending otherwise in either direction isn't honesty. It's just picking a side and calling it balance. Now zoom out, because here's the part that makes this bigger than any online label. MGTOW didn't create this shift. It's a symptom of it, not the cause. Housing costs have climbed faster than wages in a lot of major cities, which quietly delays or cancels the whole buy a house, start a family sequence for a lot of people, regardless of what forums they do or don't read. Marriage rates have been sliding for decades across most developed countries long before anyone had heard the acronym MGTOW. Dating apps rewired a lot of the courtship process into something closer to a numbers game, where a small share of men get an outsized share of the attention and a lot of everyone else gets ghosted into quiet resentment. Divorce law, in some places, still carries real financial risk that men are increasingly aware of, whether or not they'd ever call themselves part of a movement about it. Individualism itself has become a dominant cultural value for a lot of this generation. Self-care, boundaries, personal growth, protecting your peace. These phrases used to sound like therapy speak. Now they're just how people talk. Put all of that together and you get a much bigger picture than "some men are mad online." You get an entire generation, men and women both, quietly renegotiating what commitment, marriage, and traditional milestones are even supposed to mean anymore. MGTOW is one visible symptom of that renegotiation, loud in some corners, nearly invisible in most of them. But a symptom, not the root cause. Women are navigating a parallel version of the same shift, for what it's worth. Delaying marriage, prioritizing careers, becoming more selective, not less, about who gets access to their time, which means the old script isn't just being abandoned by one side while the other side waits patiently at the altar. It's being renegotiated by almost everyone at once, from both directions, mostly without coordination, mostly without anyone announcing it. That's a much stranger, much bigger cultural moment than a single online label could ever fully capture. MGTOW just happens to be the version of it that comes with a name attached. So strip away the label, strip away the forums, the angry comment sections, the caricature. What's actually underneath all of it? Maybe it was never really about avoiding women or avoiding relationships specifically. Maybe it's about control, predictability, the ability to build a life that actually reflects choices he made, instead of a script someone else wrote for him before he was old enough to know there might be other options. Purpose that comes from something he built himself, not something he inherited by default because it's what men his age are supposed to be doing. Dignity that doesn't depend on someone else's approval, someone else's timeline, someone else's definition of what a successful life looks like. Some men find that through independence. Others find the exact same thing through a marriage, a partnership, a family, built consciously, not out of obligation, because they actually chose it with open eyes. MGTOW might not be the destination for most of the men who brush up against the idea. It might just be one honest, sometimes messy attempt to answer a much older, much bigger question. What do I actually want my life to look like once I stop assuming I already know the answer? So where does that leave us? Going your own way was never really about ending up completely alone. Not for most of the men living some version of it anyway. A man can still get married, still have kids, still build a life with someone else, fully, completely. The difference is whether that path was chosen with clear eyes or simply inherited, because nobody ever presented an alternative worth considering. That's really the whole question underneath everything we just walked through. Not should men avoid relationships. Not is MGTOW right or wrong. Just, are you actually building the life you want? Or are you quietly running someone else's blueprint on autopilot and calling it your own because you never stop to check? Some men look at that question and choose independence. Some look at the exact same question and choose partnership, marriage, a family, deliberately, not by default. There's no universal right answer here. Anyone selling you one in either direction is selling you something. But the question itself doesn't go away just because you avoid it. So maybe that's the only thing worth taking from all of this. Not a verdict, not a side to pick, just a habit of actually asking the question instead of letting the blueprint answer it for you.